For this lecture, we want to talk about globalization as kind of a standalone topic. For the rest of the course, for the most part, we'll be talking about global economics. So this is a good topic to get into some basics that we'll be needing to know for the rest of the session. Talking about globalization, we're looking at lots of different things: integration of economies, telecommunications, transportation, and even cultural aspects that are diffusing across borders here. What we see is that there could be an interesting paradox developing with globalization, that it may be reinforcing sovereignty between states rather than eroding the sovereignty between states, while at the same time, states are becoming more economically interdependent with each other. And as we'll see, globalization is typically associated with global capitalism. So that's why we want to talk a little bit about capitalism first, asking some questions as far as what is capital and what does GDP mean, which is gross domestic product, which we'll get into here in a few minutes. Capital typically means, from a business standpoint, that is all of the assets that you have that are used to making your product. That's what you would call your productive capacity, as far as what you're making your product with. In this particular case, capital is just anything that measures some form of wealth, whether it's certain assets that you may have, stocks, properties, savings accounts, any type of income through wages, rents, interests, earnings, transfer payments, which is payments that typically come from the government. And so we'll look at some of those things here in a little bit. Capitalism is typically defined as to where the productive and the allocative capacities in society are privately owned, and this is part of the supply versus demand market-driven system, where the buyers and sellers come together in the marketplace and determine an equilibrium price that everybody can live with. And as a foundation of our democratic liberalist type system, property rights was a very important part of our individual freedoms, so that pretty much tailored into our capitalist system as well. Let's talk a little bit about the productive cycle in a capitalist system, where we've got households over here. HH is a very common term for households, where people live, and the firms over here, the businesses, the corporations, where the people work. Government here in the middle. So let's look at this piece by piece. The firms provide the products and the goods and the services to us in our households. So what do we provide back to the firms? Well, what we provide is consumption. We buy those products. That's what the C stand for. C is consumption, and that is the biggest driver of our economy. Between 65 and 70% of gross domestic product is measured by how much we are consuming, how much we are buying. The I is the investment, which typically goes through the banks. Then that's where we put our savings in to the banks, and the banks use that to invest to the firms. G is government expense. So government provides quite a bit of expenditures that is part of our gross domestic product here. And then exports is also a part of this measure of our gross domestic product. That is a negative. It has been a negative for couple of decades or more, and which means we import more than we export. So we'll talk about that in more detail later. So what you have over here on this side of the cycle is the gross domestic product. But this cycle keeps going around in circles, circles going in opposite directions, as you'll see. So let's look at the bottom half here. The households are providing their labor, land, and their entrepreneurialism to the firms for the firms to use. So what do the firms provide back to the households? Well, they provide the wages. The firms provide wages for the labor that we provide for the firms. The small I is the interest that we earn on this investment up here. R is the rents that we earn from the land that we are leasing to the firms. And this P here is the profit that we make working for the firms. So the people that live in the households, these are the workers and the owners that go to work at the firms, so they will share some of those profits. So therefore, on the bottom half here, this is what we have is our gross national income is the measure of this bottom section of the cycle. And what we see is generally our gross domestic product is approximately equal to our gross national income. Now looking at the middle here, where government is receiving taxes from households in the form of income taxes, but the government also provides transfer payments back to the households in the form of things like Social Security, Medicare benefits, unemployment insurance, things like that. On the other side, the firms are also paying corporate taxes to the government, but the government also provides transfer payments back to the firms. These are in the forms of things like subsidies, which we'll be talking about, which government provides grants, benefits to firms in order to protect them from foreign competition or to ensure that they will be successful, things like that, tax breaks. So those are some examples of transfer payments back to the business firms. So what you have here is the full cycle as it's going around in both directions. And you can see how this is a fairly delicate mechanism, because if something occurs up here to where potentially a break in the cycle somewhere, that demand could be halted. Once the demand for something is halted, then people will stop buying. Then the firms could potentially stop making that. And if they stop making that, then they would have to lay people off. So it is a very delicate mechanism as it goes around and around and kind of feeds on itself, because as long as we consume things, then the firms will make those things. So we purchase it, consume it, and then they make it. Purchase it, consume it, make it. And then it just keeps going around those circles. Capitalism does have several concerns that come with it. It has been very flexible. The market system has survived for a couple of centuries, more so than any other economic systems out there, because of its flexibility and its adaptability as far as what humans want and needs, and they can figure that out in the market. But there are potential problems. One is the tendency for monopolistic or oligopolistic practices. That's just typically how it works. Firms have to have a lot of pressure to keep growing. Lots of examples out there. One in particular is Facebook was looking at a young upstart called Instagram and felt that could be a threat to some of their market share. May have kind of seen a little bit of young, hungry upstart there that maybe reminded Mark Zuckerberg of himself a little bit. They could have come together with a plan to try to outcompete Instagram because of their 800 million plus pairs of eyeballs there that they had to work with, and perhaps could have come up with a comparable service to Instagram and put them out of business. But what they did instead is that they bought out Instagram, which had a total of 12 employees, and they bought them out for $1 billion because they could. So that's an example of how firms want to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger so that they can weed out competition. And that's why government keeps an eye on monopolistic practices in order to ensure more competition out there in the capitalist marketplace. Another thing that capitalism has got to deal with is the boom and bust cycles, where since it's driven by human behavior, if things are going smoothly, we're not necessarily looking ahead to the future as to what we might be doing as far as creating a bubble such as the housing bubble with the subprime mortgage crisis there that led to the Great Recession. We're not necessarily looking ahead. When times are good, we want to keep riding that gravy train, and we keep riding it and riding it, and we might even just ride it into a ditch, and then the economy will take a downturn. Regulation versus deregulation. Another thing that capitalism is constantly having to deal with. If we continue to deregulate, then there may be some things that could get out of hand that the government is not keeping an eye on, such as things like derivatives and some of the creative financial instruments that were making a lot of people a lot of money back prior to the Great Recession. And then that also bit us in the rear and exacerbated the economy into the Great Recession. The government regroups and then looks at regulating things in order to prevent that from happening. So it's a constant back and forth. Another thing we'll mention here in a little bit is that with capitalism, as firms become more successful and are constantly looking for ways to increase their efficiency and improve their profit, well, then they may deindustrialize by going to other countries, outsourcing their industrial capacity and their lower wage labor to other countries where they can save money, increase their profit. That's one of the concerns that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then another byproduct of capitalism is the inequality. Capitalism kind of runs on inequality because that's what provides the gaps to where people might start looking for ways that they can improve themselves in this market system, but also that leaves it open for exploitation and opportunism as well. But the bottom line is that inequality is something that we have to deal with in pretty much all societies. But capitalism has to deal with it in that it is a function of capitalism per se. Lots of examples out to where the inequality has increased. The question, of course, will be at what point could it be dysfunctional to society, such as America? Some other inconsistencies where at one point labor productivity and compensation were intended to go somewhat hand in hand, but as we can see over the past few decades, we're looking at the labor productivity in real output per hour has increased considerably at a higher rate than real compensation, which is wages that are in which inflation has been accounted for. So they have kind of stagnated a little bit. They did start to increase a little bit over the last couple of years, but they have also kind of leveled back out as far as real wages go. As far as the inequality goes, the income gains at the top are considerably more than the low and middle income households, as we can see right here, particularly the bottom 20%. Not a dramatic amount of increase there when you compare it to the top 1% as far as income gains. Backing up a little bit, our world economy, as it is today, really kind of has its beginnings back in the first industrial revolution in Britain, to where coal and iron were used to power society. The steam engine was invented, cotton gin, the textile industry exploded into the first industrial revolution with other technological innovations there to spur that industry, such as the spinning jenny and the power loom, things like that. And then as we get post Civil War, the Industrial Revolution hits the United States. And from there, from about 1870 to World War I, we see, which is, I don't think there's a whole lot of argument about this, the most prolific period of technological innovation in human history. Whereas with the steel production, the railroads spanning the country, the telephone, electricity, motors, vehicles, the internal combustion engine, a flight, radio, the medicine, and the improvements in health, it's just phenomenal what had occurred in this period that we still rely on to this day. Post World War II, we saw another technological jump to the computer age, the nuclear age, and this has led to the personal computers, the internet, and the nuclear power, which of course has taken a hit as far as being a source of energy because of the potential dangers of radioactivity. What are some of the factors that are accelerating globalization? Because globalization started to spike again in the 1990s, but again, our modern era economy, 90% of the technological advances have been since that 1800 period. Government policy has geared itself towards a more global economy, particularly after the Depression and after World War II, when the winners of World War II came together and created the basic framework. We've already talked about the United Nations, but we're going to talk about the economic institutions that are still our global economic institutions today as we speak, such as the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. We'll get into those. We do not want to have another global depression, another world war, so they got together and started to create the modern global economic framework. We also see that with the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, there was a consensus somewhat that capitalism had won because communism had failed yet again. And so that led to a global economic boom in the 90s, and the invention or the development of the internet really took off dramatically in that period as well.
You've got mail.
The democratic internationalism that brings countries together because of their shared democratic norms as well as market principles and the global capitalist common goals there. Those are some other things that have accelerated globalization. Looking at some more economic factors, these are going to be introducing you to some terms that we're going to be talking about in more detail later on. Trade, we're looking at exports versus imports. Exports, what we produce here and sell to other countries. Imports, what we buy from other countries. And 1/6 of our total economic activity is in trading these goods and services. So we've got merchandise trade, which is the products that we want and need that we get from other countries or that we sell to other countries. And then the growing services trade, where industries such as the insurance industries, movie industries, colleges, which bring in lots of people from other countries, and that's now at about 20% of international trade. Imports, which we have a trade imbalance, or what we would call a trade deficit, because we import more than we export. And so imports account for about 1/4 of all U.S. goods and services. That's something that we'll touch on a little bit more later on, is why that has turned out that way, particularly because of outsourcing. We see that getting products from other countries is a little bit cheaper. That helps consumers. There's also drawbacks to that as well that we'll discuss. And over the past several decades, as we've been towards a global economic system, we have lowered the barriers to being able to trade with other countries. Tariffs, which we've defined earlier, those are taxes on imports, which would tend to regulate the amount or even perhaps hinder the amount of products that you buy from other countries because it would just make them more expensive by putting a tariff on it. What we see that tariffs have dropped dramatically from an average of about 60% of the cost of products was taxed with a tariff to an average of about 4% today. Now, that may have spiked up just a little bit under the current administration that is a little bit more protectionist than previous administrations, but still extremely, considerably lower than what it used to be. This is just a list that came from a previous textbook. The author was just starting to look at things on his desk at first and started to realize how much stuff that he depended on a daily basis that came from other countries. And this is just some examples of some of the products that he was using almost on a daily basis, or some examples of some things here that we import from other countries. I mean, when you think about it, get up in the morning, if it wasn't for imports, wouldn't have that precious cup of coffee in the morning, or to be able to slice the banana into your cereal, or in some cases, your toaster might cost a lot more than it does. So there's lots of products that we get from other countries. Looking at some more economic factors that have tended to broaden more into a global economy is that we've got more productive capacity, more productive resources. There's an increased demand for raw materials and synthetic resources, so therefore we've got to keep looking, reaching out for more places to get them. And as human beings start to taste more of the benefits of being in a higher standard of living, then that starts to build on itself as well. Not only do we have the improved technology and the improved communication capacities with our internet and things like that, we also have improved transportation where you've got freighters that can carry a tremendous amount of goods overseas. Let's look at a couple of terms here that we'll be talking about more later. One of which is called foreign direct investment, which I'll be referring to as FDI from here on out. This is the investment that is made by multinational corporations that may be housed or homed in one country, such as the United States, but then they invest in other countries. They build factories in other countries. They mine resources or purchase land in other countries in order to expand and grow, and they put people to work over there in those other countries so that they can continue to make more products and sell those products back to us, even at perhaps a cheaper price back here in America. So FDI is something that developing countries in particular are quite hungry for, and in some cases desperate for, because these big multinational corporations could invest in them and provide capital and provide opportunities to put people to work to improve their economy and standard of living in those poor developing countries. I mean, we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about why those poor developing countries are not very attractive targets for foreign and direct investment, particularly because of their political instability. And about 500 multinationals in the entire world that account for almost one half of the entire world's gross national product. The liquid investments are what we call foreign portfolio investment, FPI. These are the stocks and bonds that can be bought and sold, and they're, I say, more liquid because they can get sold and moved out from one bank to the next or from one country to the next. So that's another form of investment, whereas FDI is more permanent because when you build a factory in a foreign country, can't just pick that up and move that back over to America. whereas stocks and bonds, savings, things like that can be moved much quicker or liquefied. The currency market, and this grows exponentially. We're clearly at more than $5 trillion a day that is exchanging on the currency markets where dollars are converted into euros or wands are converted into dollars, things like that, exploiting price differences where huge financial firms are making profits off of these exchanges. And these market exchanges are what sets these rates between currencies. We'll talk about that considerably more within the next couple of chapters as well. The multinational banks, the biggest banks in the world, the 11 biggest ones, each have assets that are greater than $1 trillion each. These are where lots of investment flows through these banks. Looking at globalization from a couple of other standpoints, cultural globalization is something that kind of goes along with this, to where if something is attractive in one country that appeals to humans, that humans like, well, then that's quite likely that humans in another country are going to like that too. So you look at all kinds of cultural elements, whether it's fast food or basketball, sports, music, even attire, if those things catch on, are attractive in one country, or if they're cool in one country, it's more than likely that they could be cool amongst young people in particular in another country. We know that with globalization, the United States being the biggest economic power and somewhat of the driver of Western capitalism, we see that English is becoming more of the language behind global capitalism. Consumer products intensified towards U.S. industries. Here's an example. The United States film industry earns 61% of its revenue from the overseas market. That's one reason why we see the special effects comic book superhero sequel movies so popular, is because they have a universal appeal. Don't have to worry too much about English or plot as much with these blockbuster entertainment type movies. Conversely, not so much, because Americans don't like to read those subtitles at the bottom of the screen there. Bottom line is, what we're looking at here is that the United States is somewhat at the forefront of this cultural globalization, and this might turn some cultures off. We do see that somewhat in the Middle East, perhaps even in some Asian cultures, that this amalgamation of Western cultural elements may be somewhat off-putting. Information, of course, is being globalized as well with new technology. 6 billion cell phone subscriptions worldwide, 1 billion with mobile internet access. I was just reading an article just the other day that said that 90% of people in the Philippines have a cell phone, while only 75% of the population has access to their own sanitary toilet. So that gives you an idea of how important information technology is. We've touched a little bit on the impact of social networks as far as both the positives and the negatives of social networks, to where it does bring people together and spreads information. The Arab Spring uprisings were driven somewhat by social networking, but we also see how fake news and other things can be spread through social networks. The digital divide is still in play, where 70% of all the people in the world that have internet access are in what we call the global north. We'll talk about the north-south divide here pretty soon, but what that means is the developed world, or the rich world. The debate is whether or not to make it more of a government-controlled network or a regulated public utility versus having a completely free flow of information. Authoritarian states do fear that free flow of information, but even democratic states may want to get a little bit of regulation involved in order to prevent the major corporations from dominating it in certain ways. And we've also talked about how even firms such as Google and Facebook have been tasked to monitor their own problems with the spread of disinformation. So let's wrap it up here with a little bit of the pros and cons of globalization. As far as the positives of globalization, we all tend to see kind of a consensus, particularly with global capitalism. Again, we've talked about the problems with global capitalism, but it does provide prosperity and wealth to a certain number of people that are plugged into it and have access to it. And that does have broad social benefits as well if we can get more people plugged into it and being able to use it fairly. Also see that prosperity does tend to correlate with democracies, that free market has been somewhat of a package deal with free elections. One of the things that helps sustain democracies is if your prosperity gets a little bit better. There is some amount of interdependence between states, which by relying on other states for certain things, that improves relations between them. And the amalgamation, providing benefits in that if there are things that human beings like, well, then that brings human beings together with common tastes and interests and things like that. And they all seem to boil down to the common element of that there's less conflict. Now, that doesn't mean that conflict could flare up if two states are dealing with each other and something goes awry or they're not getting along on this particular thing and it falls apart. Yes, there could be conflict, but particularly over the last 500 years, as more states become interconnected with each other economically and culturally, then there is generally less conflict over a long period of time. And we talked about that in the last chapter, where the amount of violence in the world has decreased dramatically over the past century. Now, looking at the concerns, these are the ones that we'll be talking about more as we go, the basic concerns with globalization. And some of these also have to do with the problems of capitalism as well, that the benefits are not distributed equally, that inequality continues to grow, even though people in general, overall, are getting a little bit more prosperous. Well, that's weighed more heavily at the top. So the inequality continues to grow. And unfortunately, one of the things that we're dealing with is that also occurs at the state level. As the world goes a little bit more capitalist, evolving into a global capitalist system, well, inequality is also increasing between rich countries and poor countries. So it's a dilemma. It's what we call it lifts all boats, to where all countries in general are improving in their prosperity. However, the inequality gap is also growing between rich and poor states as well. The developed states have often been accused of exploiting the poor states. Now, that's more of a rational behavior than exploitation, because if you are a country that has evolved with this capitalist scheme and you want it to continue to work for you, but you know that if everybody's involved, then it's going to work for everyone, well, then you're going to want everybody to follow your rules and do it like you did. Fairly rational behavior. So therefore, that puts pressure on the poor countries to open up their economies, similar to how the rich states are. But there's some double standards that we'll talk about more in detail later. And the bottom line is the poor countries, or the least developed countries, lack that adequate economic base in order to compete on this global scale. And as we'll see, their biggest drawback is political instability. because as long as they continue to remain unstable politically, they're not going to be able to get these other factors shored up that's going to make them either a more attractive investment opportunity or even more able to get plugged in to this global capitalist system. Some fears are that this cultural globalization could produce something of a monoculture of Western capitalist style consumers, materialistic type humans, not as big of a concern when you consider all the different cultures out there that are going, even if they do go capitalist, they're going to adapt it to their own wants and needs. But yes, as far as needing to consume products in order for your economy to grow, that will obviously be somewhat of a concern. Another thing that we'll be talking about more is that the multinational corporations in this global regime, which is not regulated, they can pick and choose where they want to go in order to try to maximize their profit and therefore continuously escape regulations while at the same time using those profits to lobby governments in order to get more advantages. And the outsourcing, we've already touched on that. In order to try to increase their profit, they can deindustrialize or outsource their labor to countries that have a bigger, cheaper labor pool, save money there, selling products back to the United States at cheaper prices, which consumers like. But there's a trade off there as far as less jobs, less high paying jobs as a result. So, this has been the lecture on globalization, where I wanted to touch on some basic terms as we get into the last section of the course talking about global economics.